The summer of 2004 in Jefferson City, Missouri, had started like any other, with long, golden days and the lazy hum of cicadas filling the air. But for the Thompson family, it would become the summer that changed everything. Hannah Delaney, 22, a recent college graduate working as an assistant at the local library, vanished without a trace. Her absence was first noticed when she failed to return home after her evening shift, and her roommates, initially assuming she had stayed late helping with a community project, grew increasingly worried as hours turned into an agonizing night. The small town buzzed with concern, neighbors and friends retracing her last known steps, desperately hoping for a simple explanation that never came. The investigation began immediately, but the early leads were frustratingly thin. Hannah's car was found parked outside the library, her personal belongings untouched, and there was no sign of struggle nearby. The police canvassed the area, questioned coworkers, friends, and even distant acquaintances, but each lead seemed to end in a dead end. Her family, friends, and the community were left in a fog of fear and uncertainty. Every unanswered question gnawed at them, and the media attention only heightened the tension, painting a picture of a town gripped by an invisible menace. Families walked their streets cautiously, and even familiar places seemed tainted by worry. As weeks turned into months, the case began to chill. The trail of Hannah's disappearance ran cold, and investigators had to contend with the reality that someone had taken her from the community without leaving clues. The Delaney family faced an unrelenting sense of helplessness, the agony of not knowing compounded by each passing day. Memories of Hannah's laughter, her bright smile, and her dreams of a future in library sciences haunted the home she once filled with warmth. Friends organized search parties, printed flyers, and held vigils, clinging to the hope that she might still be found. The town, normally lively and neighborly, became subdued, as everyone struggled with the creeping fear that a predator lurked among them, invisible yet present. Years passed, and Hannah's disappearance became one of those cold cases that lingered in the public memory, whispered about in grocery stores, coffee shops, and schoolyards. Police files gathered dust, but detectives kept a careful eye on any emerging leads. While the case appeared frozen in time, the evolution of technology quietly offered a glimmer of hope. DNA analysis, which had been in its infancy in 2004, advanced rapidly over the following decade. The introduction of genealogy databases, once controversial, provided law enforcement with a powerful new tool to link crime scene evidence to potential suspects through distant relatives. It was an approach that had solved other cold cases across the country, and the Delaney case, though long dormant, became a candidate for this new wave of investigative innovation. In the spring of 2019, nearly 15 years after Hannah's disappearance, investigators decided to revisit the case. The decision came after a retired detective, who had worked the initial investigation, suggested re-examining old evidence using the latest DNA technology. Crime scene samples, once insufficiently analyzed due to the limitations of the time, were now processed with advanced methods that could generate highly detailed genetic profiles. Every hair strand, skin cell, and trace of biological material was scrutinized under the microscope of modern forensic science. When the DNA from Hannah's clothing was uploaded into a genealogy database, a distant familial match emerged, pointing to a previously overlooked branch of connections. The revelation sent a shockwave through the investigative team. A man named Raymond Ellis, a local contractor who had lived in the city during the time of Hannah's disappearance, became a person of interest. Although he had no criminal record and had been considered an unlikely suspect back in 2004, the genetic evidence could not be ignored. Detectives began a meticulous review of his activities, associates, and whereabouts during the critical period. Interviews were conducted discreetly, and his social circles were quietly mapped. The more investigators learned, the more disturbing patterns emerged. Eyewitness accounts from the time, once dismissed as irrelevant, suddenly gained weight when cross-referenced with Ellis's movements. As the investigation deepened, it became apparent that Ellis had maintained a low profile in the community, a fact that had helped him evade suspicion for so long. Neighbors described him as polite, if somewhat distant, and no one could recall behavior that suggested danger. Yet the evidence now painted a different picture, one that combined modern science with the careful reevaluation of old facts. Detectives realized that the initial oversight was not negligence, but a reflection of the limitations of the time. The breakthroughs provided by DNA technology were bridging gaps that human observation alone could not cover, bringing clarity to a case long shrouded in uncertainty. The breakthrough created a palpable sense of tension in Jefferson City. The local police, who had long hoped to provide closure to Hannah's family, now faced the delicate task of building a case strong enough for prosecution. The community, still carrying the memory of the vanished young woman, watched with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Detectives obtained a warrant and collected a fresh DNA sample from Ellis, confirming the match and solidifying their case. The evidence was irrefutable, a combination of genetic science and investigative persistence that finally pointed directly to the individual responsible for the years of anguish. When Ellis was arrested, the impact on the Delaney family was profound. Relief, shock, and lingering pain mingled in their expressions as they processed the long-awaited news. For 15 years, they had endured uncertainty, clinging to hope while confronting despair. The arrest brought an overwhelming flood of emotions, mixing gratitude for the detectives' relentless work with the sorrow of time irretrievably lost. Friends and neighbors, once cautious and wary, now gathered to support the family, sharing memories of Hannah and expressing a communal sense of relief. It was a moment that highlighted both the cruelty of delayed justice and the profound power of modern investigative methods to correct past oversights. In the weeks following the arrest, prosecutors meticulously built a case that would ensure Ellis faced accountability. The courtroom became a stage for the retelling of a story that had haunted the community for over a decade, blending eyewitness accounts, forensic analysis, and the compelling narrative of a life unjustly taken. Each testimony carried emotional weight, and the family's presence served as a poignant reminder of the human cost behind the statistics and files. Investigators, lawyers, and forensic experts worked tirelessly to ensure that justice would not falter again, honoring both the memory of Hannah Delaney and the integrity of the legal process. The small town of Jefferson City, which had weathered years of fear and uncertainty, now faced the complex journey of healing. The arrest did not erase the trauma or the loss, but it provided validation, acknowledgement, and an opportunity for the community to reclaim a sense of safety. Conversations among neighbors shifted from whispered fears to shared relief, and programs aimed at supporting victims and families gained new attention and resources. The story of Hannah's disappearance, long a source of sorrow, began to transform into a narrative of perseverance, hope, and the relentless pursuit of justice. As the investigation continued, new layers of the case began to unfold, revealing chilling details that had been buried under years of uncertainty. Detectives discovered that Ellis had meticulously concealed his interactions with Hannah in 2004. Old phone records and financial transactions, once overlooked, painted a subtle but unmistakable trail of premeditation. It became clear that he had followed her routines, studied her schedule, and manipulated situations to remain unnoticed. For the investigators, these findings transformed a previously perplexing disappearance into a portrait of calculated intent, and each revelation brought a renewed intensity to their pursuit of justice. The community, still reeling from the arrest, began to share their own experiences from 15 years prior. Neighbors recalled small, odd details that had seemed insignificant at the time, a shadow outside a window, a passing vehicle circling the block. But when pieced together, these fragments created a clearer picture of that fateful night. Friends described Hannah's careful, responsible nature and how her disappearance had shaken the town's sense of normalcy. The emotional weight of their memories underscored the significance of the breakthrough. The past was finally colliding with the present, demanding acknowledgement and closure. Meanwhile, the Delaney family faced a whirlwind of emotions. Every conversation about Ellis brought a wave of anger, relief, and grief. Their attempts to reconcile the loving daughter they had lost with the man who had caused unimaginable suffering were both painful and necessary. Counseling sessions, family meetings, and community support groups became lifelines, helping them navigate the complex mix of vindication and sorrow. Friends who had stood by them through the long years of uncertainty now offered solace in the face of the legal and emotional storm. Each day brought new challenges, but also a fragile hope that justice, long delayed, was finally within reach. Inside the legal system, prosecutors prepared a case that balanced the overwhelming scientific evidence with the need to humanize Hannah's story. They meticulously re-examined every witness statement, every forensic report, and every piece of documentation collected over the years. Courtroom strategy focused not only on the DNA and genealogy evidence, but also on the narrative of a life interrupted, a family torn apart, and a community left fearful. Every detail was scrutinized to ensure that the prosecution's case was airtight, capable of withstanding scrutiny, and leaving no room for doubt. The defense attempted to challenge the new technology used in linking Ellis to the crime, arguing that distant familial DNA matches were speculative and unreliable. They questioned the chain of custody, the interpretation of genetic markers, and the validity of retrospective analysis. But the prosecution countered with expert testimony from forensic specialists who explained the precision, reliability, and extraordinary advancements in DNA science. Their arguments highlighted how the very limitations of 2004 had been overcome by the rigor and ingenuity of modern science, transforming cold evidence into incontrovertible proof. As the trial approached, the town of Jefferson City braced for the emotional intensity that would accompany courtroom proceedings. News crews returned, neighbors attended in waves, and a sense of history repeating itself, but with resolution this time, hung over the city. The courtroom itself became a place where long-held fears, suppressed grief, and unresolved questions converged. Families who had waited nearly 2 decades to hear justice argued, whispered, and wept in quiet anticipation. The trial was not just a legal process. It was a collective act of remembrance and acknowledgement, validating the trauma that the community had endured silently for so many years. During the proceedings, the psychological profile of Ellis emerged, revealing a man who had outwardly blended into the community but harbored dangerous tendencies beneath the surface. Friends and acquaintances were stunned to learn that someone they had considered ordinary could commit such a heinous act. Testimony from behavioral experts explained how predators often operate within a community unnoticed, exploiting trust and routine to isolate victims. Each revelation added layers of complexity to the narrative, making the story gripping, horrifying, and tragically believable. Perhaps the most difficult moments for the Delaney family came when the prosecution recounted Hannah's final hours. Investigators reconstructed the night she disappeared with painstaking detail, relying on testimony, surveillance, and digital footprints. The depiction was harrowing. Hannah's last interactions, her final smiles to friends, her steps along familiar streets, all under the watchful eyes of someone who had planned her abduction. For those in the courtroom, the scene was both heart-wrenching and crucial, a reminder of the human cost behind forensic evidence and statistical probabilities. It was this narrative, combined with scientific certainty, that made the case so compelling and emotionally resonant. Outside the courtroom, Jefferson City grappled with the aftermath of 15 years of uncertainty. Local schools and community centers held discussions on safety and vigilance, reflecting on how the town could protect its residents while honoring those lost to tragedy. Vigils were organized in Hannah's memory, turning pain into communal strength. Conversations once muted by fear now carried voices of determination and resilience. Residents shared memories of Hannah, each anecdote reinforcing the sense that she had been more than a statistic. She had been a daughter, a friend, and a bright light snuffed out far too early. The trial itself became a roller coaster of tension and revelation. Witnesses who had remained silent or overlooked for years were finally given a voice. Each testimony seemed to add weight to the painstakingly assembled case against Ellis. As jurors listened to the scientific evidence intertwined with human stories, a realization grew. Justice was no longer hypothetical. It was imminent. The community, long accustomed to fear and uncertainty, began to glimpse the possibility of resolution. And yet the shadow of what had been lost could never fully be erased. As the prosecution neared its conclusion, the final pieces of evidence were presented, including the genetic genealogy match that had initially identified Ellis. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the forensic specialist explained how Hannah's DNA, preserved through careful evidence handling, ultimately led to the identification of a distant relative, and through meticulous investigative work, to Ellis himself. The revelation was met with audible gasps, a mix of relief and shock sweeping through the gallery. The power of modern science, combined with dogged human determination, had finally illuminated a case that had been dark for over 15 years. The emotional resonance of the trial continued to unfold even after the final arguments. Members of the community who had lived with anxiety and suspicion found themselves grappling with conflicting emotions: satisfaction that the perpetrator was caught, grief for the irretrievable years lost, and awe at the tenacity of law enforcement and forensic science. Conversations that once centered on fear now shifted to admiration for the diligence of investigators and the relentless pursuit of truth. The town's sense of identity, once fractured by uncertainty, slowly began to mend as a collective story of justice, courage, and perseverance emerged. The final weeks of the trial were marked by intense anticipation. The jurors, tasked with weighing decades of evidence, heard every account, every scientific detail, and every recollection from friends and family. The courtroom became a microcosm of the town's long struggle, a concentrated space where grief, hope, anger, and relief collided. For the Delaney family, each day of testimony was both excruciating and necessary, a ritual of remembrance and reclamation. The community, long forced into silence, now participated vicariously, witnessing justice unfold in a way that honored Hannah's memory and provided validation for their collective pain. The day the jury reached its verdict arrived with an almost unbearable tension. The town of Jefferson City held its breath, a community frozen in time as they waited for the culmination of 15 years of uncertainty. Inside the courtroom, the jurors filed back into their seats after hours of deliberation, their faces solemn and measured. For the Delaney family, the moment was surreal, a mixture of hope and dread battling in equal measure. Every second stretched endlessly, memories of Hannah's laughter and the absence left by her disappearance flooding their minds. The courtroom seemed to pulse with the weight of history, every person present acutely aware that a long-standing injustice was finally poised to be addressed. When the foreperson announced that Ellis was found guilty on all counts, the room erupted in a complex wave of emotions. Relief and grief collided, tears streaming freely from friends, family, and even strangers who had followed the case for years. The verdict was not just a legal pronouncement. It was the embodiment of every unanswered question, every sleepless night, and every year of fear and speculation. The weight of time that had once made justice seem impossible was lifted, replaced by the cathartic acknowledgement that the truth, long obscured, had finally prevailed. The Delaney family clung to one another, sobbing openly, their sorrow now tempered by a profound sense of vindication. Outside the courtroom, the community reacted with a mix of celebration and somber reflection. Local news stations broadcast the outcome live, capturing the expressions of those who had lived with the shadow of Hannah's disappearance for more than a decade. Neighbors, Friends and residents who had once whispered fears over backyard fences now stood in public spaces, talking about closure, resilience, and the triumph of persistence. Memorials were quietly organized, not just in Hannah's honor, but also as a recognition of the unyielding work of the investigators who had refused to let the case fade into obscurity. The emotional resonance of the verdict rippled far beyond the legal system, touching hearts in ways that numbers and statistics could never convey. In the days following the verdict, investigators reflected on the painstaking process that had finally unraveled the mystery. They spoke about the challenges of revisiting a case long considered cold, emphasizing how modern forensic technology, particularly the advances in DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, had rewritten the rules of criminal investigation. These methods, once experimental, had now become crucial tools in holding perpetrators accountable. Detectives recounted the meticulous hours spent reviewing old evidence, the countless interviews revisited, and the network of collaboration between forensic experts, local law enforcement, and family members that had culminated in this moment. The story was as much about science as it was about perseverance, a testament to human determination in the face of relentless uncertainty. The Delaney family, while relieved by the conviction, faced the complicated task of emotional recovery. Years of unanswered questions, haunting what-ifs, and the persistent pain of absence could not be erased overnight. Therapy sessions and community support became central to their healing process, helping them navigate the overlapping emotions of relief, grief, and lingering sorrow. Friends and neighbors continued to offer support, sharing memories of Hannah that helped solidify her presence in their hearts despite her absence in life. Each anecdote, every smile remembered, served to humanize her story beyond the confines of crime statistics, reinforcing the importance of memory, legacy, and communal recognition of loss. Meanwhile, Ellis awaited sentencing, a man whose outward composure belied the gravity of his actions. Court-appointed psychologists and investigators painted a picture of a calculating individual, one whose ability to manipulate circumstances allowed him to remain undetected for years. Testimonies revealed how his careful orchestration of events and meticulous avoidance of scrutiny contributed to the prolonged duration of the case's unresolved status. The courtroom audience, many of whom had personally known Hannah or her family, found it chilling to learn how ordinary appearances masked extraordinary malice. The psychological revelations deepened the community's understanding of the crime, while reinforcing the necessity of vigilance and the power of forensic innovation. The sentencing itself was a tense, emotional affair. Victims' statements, read aloud in court, painted a picture of the human cost behind the scientific evidence. Friends and family shared their grief, recounting not just Hannah's final moments but her hopes, dreams, and the impact she had on those around her. These personal stories transformed the legal proceeding from a simple matter of judgment into a profound act of communal closure. When the judge pronounced a lengthy, appropriate sentence, the Delaney family and supporters felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The weight of years had been partially lifted, but the memory of loss remained etched in their hearts, an indelible mark of both tragedy and resilience. In the weeks following the sentencing, Jefferson City began to process the emotional and cultural impact of the case. Local schools incorporated discussions about safety, awareness, and the importance of community vigilance. Residents spoke more openly about their fears and experiences, creating an environment of shared responsibility and collective healing. Vigil services and memorial events allowed the community to honor Hannah while acknowledging the courage of investigators who had refused to give up. These gatherings, infused with grief and hope, became spaces where trauma was recognized and transformed into a catalyst for education, awareness, and collective solidarity. The story of Hannah Delaney and the cold case's resolution also gained national attention, highlighting the transformative power of modern investigative techniques. News outlets featured in-depth analyses of how genetic genealogy, DNA profiling, and meticulous detective work intersected to bring long overdue justice. Experts discussed the implications for other unsolved cases, emphasizing that time, once considered an obstacle, could now be an ally in uncovering the truth. The narrative captivated audiences not merely because of its dramatic twists, but because it showcased the enduring power of human persistence and innovation in pursuit of justice. The Delaney family, though still grappling with profound loss, began channeling their energy into advocacy and community outreach. They spoke publicly about the importance of preserving evidence, supporting investigative efforts, and raising awareness about unresolved cases. Their work provided solace and purpose, transforming personal grief into a broader impact. Hannah's story became a rallying point for families across the nation facing similar challenges, illustrating that hope, resilience, and determination could prevail even in the darkest circumstances. As the months passed, the town of Jefferson City slowly found a new rhythm. The fear and uncertainty that had lingered for over 15 years gradually gave way to cautious optimism. People who had once avoided dark streets or trusted strangers reluctantly now reclaimed their sense of normalcy. Yet, the memory of Hannah and the lessons learned from her case remained ever present. The community had witnessed firsthand the fragility of safety and the extraordinary perseverance required to confront injustice. The story became a testament not only to the capabilities of modern science, but also to the enduring strength of human resolve in seeking truth and justice. Ultimately, the resolution of the Missouri 2004 cold case underscored a profound truth. Justice delayed is painful, but not impossible. With the convergence of relentless investigation, evolving technology, and the unwavering determination of those who refuse to forget, a life interrupted could finally be honored, and a community could reclaim a sense of security and hope. The twists, the heartbreak, and the years of uncertainty coalesced into a story that was both a warning and an inspiration, a reminder that no matter how long the darkness lingers, light, truth, and justice can prevail.